Welcome to Notes on Biogeochemical Cycles. In these video lecture notes, we're going to go over the nitrogen cycle, we'll discuss the phosphorus cycle, and we'll also talk a little bit about limiting nutrients. Let's get started with nitrogen. Nitrogen is a required component in DNA, RNA, and proteins. It accounts for around 3% of the mass of a human body, and it makes up 78% of the air that we breathe. N2 gas. N2 gas is made up of two nitrogen atoms, and those two nitrogen atoms, that bond that exists between them is very, very strong. Most organisms can't take in N2 gas and use it. They can't break apart that bond that exists between the two nitrogen atoms. Certain nitrogen-fixing bacteria can do this. They can take in gaseous N2 gas, break the bond between the nitrogens, and turn them into a usable form of nitrogen called ammonium ions. That ammonium then is taken in by plant tissues by the producers, and they grow, right? Because and nitrogen is available. Nitrogen ions are a limiting nutrient for producers. That means that when nitrogen ions are not available to a plant, either on land or in the water, then there will be no new growth. Why? Because nitrogen is necessary in DNA, RNA, and protein. Without it, without those building blocks, you can't build more. This is what nitrogen-fixing bacteria looks like. These guys are found in the roots or near the roots of legumes like peas and beans. The reason why nitrogen-fixing bacteria are discussed in an AP environmental science class is because smart farmers can use these bacteria to sustainably farm. Plants like corn are going to use up the nitrogen found in soil and not give any back. So if a farmer plants both corn and a legume like maybe a bean plant that has those nitrogen-fixing bacteria, what will happen is that those bacteria will take in gaseous N2, convert it into a nitrogen ion form that both the plant, the legume plant, and the corn both like. So you can kind of recycle and add those nutrients back into depleted soil too. Okay, so this is what our nitrogen cycle is going to look like in the end when you do notes on this. Just think about it's going to be about that big, okay? Let's go through the piece by piece. Nitrogen gas exists in the atmosphere. Nitrogen ions can exist in the hydrosphere, in the lithosphere, and also in the biosphere as ammonium and nitrate ions both. Nitrogen gas via nitrogen-fixing bacteria is able to enter into the biosphere because those guys are able to break apart nitrogen gas and turn it into a usable form, a form that producers can use. Some of that nitrogen ion that those bacteria create can also be exist within the lithosphere and the abiotic soil, the non-living soil as well. When that happens, nitrogen now enters into the food web through those producers, which are eaten by the consumers, right, and ultimately broken down again by decomposers. In fact, that's how the nitrogen gas enters back into the atmosphere from the biospheres through decomposition. Bacterial decomposition will break apart the nitrogen, set it back up into the atmosphere, where that cycle continues anew. The nitrogen found within the soil in the lithosphere can sometimes leach out into the hydrosphere. It also occurs through fertilizer runoff. The fertilizers that farmers use are very high in nitrogen. Why? Because nitrogen is a limiting nutrient. So there's a lot of nitrogen in fertilizer. What happens? It starts to rain. Some of that fertilizer can run off in a watershed and end up in a lake and a river, something along those lines, right? When that happens, now you have increased amounts of nitrogen. Think about what happens if you have lots of nitrogen in an area. You're going to increase the growth of producers, in this case, oftentimes algae. I'll show you what a picture of that looks like in a minute. Okay, so nitrogen can enter from the hydrosphere through aquatic producers too. Again, it enters into that food web. There are certain bacteria that are also able to break apart the nitrogen ions and send it back up into the atmosphere as N2 gas. And that's a nitrogen cycle in a couple words or less. Let's go into the phosphorus cycle. Phosphorus is a required component found in DNA, RNA, and ATP. That's that usable form of chemical energy found within cells. Phosphorus accounts for less than 1% of the mass of a human body. It's found in rocks, which can be weathered. And think about it, if a rock with phosphorus weathers, then the phosphorus ions can enter into streams, into soil, even into aquatic systems. Like nitrogen, phosphorus is a limiting nutrient, especially in aquatic ecosystems. Because it's a limiting nutrient, there's very little of it found within hydrosphere. Why? Because organisms will snatch up that phosphorus as quick as they can get it. So it's gone, right? And then grow as a result, right? So when it is available, life will thrive. And this is what it looks like when life thrives. In the presence of these limiting nutrients like phosphorus and nitrogen, we'll sometimes get algal blooms. Imagine fertilizer high in phosphorus and nitrogen runs off into a lake. It finds its way there. Phosphorus and nitrogen available now. The algae will likely snatch up all of those, the nitrogen and phosphorus, start to grow and create this bloom. This is a bad thing in an aquatic ecosystem because this stuff will eventually die. When it dies, it decomposes, and those decomposers are going to use up all of the oxygen in the lake, which deprives oxygen from other organisms from continuing to live. So kind of a bad thing, right? This is what the phosphorus cycle is going to look like when we're finished. So push pause here, I suppose, or just know that we're going to fill it up kind of like a half page, I think. Let's start building it. Phosphorus is not found in the atmosphere. It only exists in solid and ion form, not in gaseous form. It's found within the hydrosphere, the lithosphere, and the biosphere. Phosphorus can enter into the hydrosphere through weathering. So those rocks that have phosphate ions in it, they weather and eventually ends up in water. This also occurs because fertilizers are high in both phosphorus and nitrogen, and sometimes runoff allows those limiting nutrients to enter into aquatic ecosystems. The phosphorus can leave the lithosphere and enter into the biosphere through producers in both the soil and in those aquatic ecosystems. When that happens, then phosphorus enters the food web, and there's that nice cycle, right? Decomposition, more growth through producers, eating, right? And then death again, and the nice cycle continues. The phosphate ions can also precipitate out from solution and form solids and enter back into the lithosphere as well, from the hydrosphere up into the soiled lithosphere. And also the biosphere can contribute when something dies through decomposition. Bacteria are going to break apart the phosphorus and phosphate ions, and they'll be available again within the soils. So that is both the nitrogen and the phosphorus cycle. Make sure that you can describe how nitrogen cycles through Earth's spheres. Make sure that you can describe how phosphorus cycles through the Earth's spheres, and explain how limiting nutrients promote and prevent growth.